Today in UPSC History View, India, being the largest democracy in the world and an independent and sovereign nation, can be proud of several courageous freedom fighters. Hello and welcome to UPSC History View. Today let's learn about Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh fought an Indian freedom fighter considered one of the most famous revolutionaries of the Indian independence movement. For that reason, Indians often referred to him as Shahid Bhagat Singh, the word Shahid meaning martyr. Many believe him one of the earliest Marxists in India. Bhagat Singh had been one of the leaders and founders of the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association or HSRA. Born to a family which had earlier been involved in revolutionary activities against the British Raj in India, Bhagat Singh as a teenager studied European revolutionary movements, had been attracted to anarchism and communism. Bhagat Singh became involved in numerous revolutionary organizations. He quickly rose in the ranks of the Hindustan Republican Association or HRA. He became one of its leaders, converting it to the HSRA or the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. Bhagat Singh gained support when he underwent a 63-day fast in jail, demanding equal rights for Indian and British political prisoners. He was hanged for shooting a police officer in response to the killing of veteran socialist activist Lala Lajpat Rai. His legacy prompted youth in India to begin fighting for Indian independence and also increased the rise of socialism in India. Bhagat Singh was given the title Shahid or martyr. He grew up at an exciting time for the independence movement in India. During his lifetime, Mahatma Gandhi developed his non-violence philosophy to deal with Indian independence. His philosophy, based in Hindu thought and practice, had compatibility with Buddhism, Jainism, Islam, Christianity. Bhagat Singh joined Gandhi as a boy, putting into practice Gandhi's non-violent resistance teaching. Whereas Mahatma Gandhi went the way of the spiritual teachings of Hinduism, Buddha and Christ, Bhagat Singh went the way of Marx, angels and violence. Bhagat Singh, an atheist and a Marxist, rejected Gandhi's commitment to God and peaceful resistance. That Bhagat Singh felt angry about British colonial rule is not surprising. Most Indians hated British rule. If Singh could have overthrown the British colonial government and installed his own brand of communism and atheism, India would have been cast into some dark ages. Instead, India by and large rejected Bhagat Singh's approach and embraced Gandhi's. Due to that wise decision, India is a vibrant country right now. Let's take a look at the early life of Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh had been born into a Sandhu family to Sardar Kishan Singh Sandhu and Vidyavati in the Khatkar Kalan village near Banga in the Layalpur district of Punjab on September 28, 1907. Bhagat Singh's name meant devotee. He had been the patriotic Sikh family, participating in numerous movements supporting independence of India. The Hindu reformist Arya Samaj influenced his father. Bhagat Singh's uncle Ajit Singh and Swaran Singh both took part in the Ghadar party led by Kartar Singh Sarabha. Ajit Singh fled to Iran to avoid pending legal cases against him, while Swaran Singh died from hanging. As a child, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre that took place in Punjab in 1919 deeply affected Bhagat Singh. When Mahatma Gandhi started the non-cooperation movement in 1920, he became an active participant at age 13. Bhagat Singh had great hopes that Gandhi would bring freedom in India, but he felt disappointed when Gandhi called off that movement following the Chauri Chaura riot in 1922. At that point, Bhagat Singh had openly defied the British and followed Gandhi's wishes by burning his government school books and any British imported clothing. In 1923, Bhagat famously won an essay competition set by the Punjab Hindi Sahitya Sammelan. This grabbed the attention of members of the Punjab Hindi Sahitya Sammelan, including his General Secretary Professor Bhim Sen Vidyalankar. At that age, Bhagat Singh quoted famous Punjabi literature and discussed the problems of the Punjab. He read a lot of poetry and literature written by Punjabi writers. Allama Iqbal, an Indian freedom fighter from Sialkot, became his favorite poet. In his teenage years, Bhagat Singh, studying at the National College in Lahore, ran away from home to escape early marriage. Bhagat Singh became a member of the organization Naujawan Bharat Sabha, translated to Youth Society of India. In the Naujawan Bharat Sabha, Singh and his fellow revolutionaries grew popular amongst the youth. Bhagat Singh also joined the Hindustan Republican Association at the request of Professor Vidya Lankar, then headed by Ram Prasad Bismil and Ashfaqullah Khan. Bhagat Singh may have had the knowledge of the Kakori train robbery. He wrote for and edited Urdu and Punjabi newspapers published from Amritsar. In September 1928, a meeting of various revolutionaries from across India had been called at Delhi under the banner of the Kirti Kisan Party. Bhagat Singh served as the secretary of the meeting. He also carried out later revolutionary activities as a leader of that association. The capture and hanging of the main HRA leaders necessitated his and Sukhdev's quick promotion to higher ranks in the party. Let's learn about the later revolutionary activities of Bhagat Singh. Lala Lajpat Rai's death and the murder of Saunders. The British government created a commission under Sir John Seaman to report on the current political situation in India in 1928. The Indian political parties boycotted the commission because Indians had been excluded from representation, protests erupting throughout the country. When the commission visited Lahore on October 30, 1928, Lala Lajpat Rai led the protest against the commission in a silent, non-violent march, but the police responded with violence. The police chief beat Lala Lajpat Rai severely and he later succumbed to his injuries. Bhagat Singh, an eyewitness to that event, vowed to take revenge. He joined with other revolutionaries Shivram Rajguru, Jai Gopal and Sukhdev Thapar in a conspiracy to kill the police chief. Jai Gopal had been assigned to identify the chief and signal for Singh to shoot. In a case of mistaken identity, Gopal signaled Singh on the appearance of J.P. Saunders, a deputy superintendent of police. Thus Singh shot Saunders instead of Scott. He quickly left Lahore to escape the police. To avoid recognition, he shaved his beard and cut his hair, a violation of one of the sacred tenets of Sikhism. Next, the event of the bomb in the assembly. In the face of actions by the revolutionaries, the British government enacted the Defence of India Act to give more power to the police. The act, defeated in the council by one vote, purposed to combat revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh. The act later passed under the ordinance that claimed the act served the best interest of the public. In response to the act, the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association planned to explode a bomb in the assembly where the ordinance would be passed. Originally, Azad attempted to stop Bhagat Singh from carrying out the bombing. The remainder of the party forced him to succumb to Singh's wishes, deciding that Bhagat Singh and Batukeshwar Dutt, another revolutionary, would throw the bombs in the assembly. On April 8, 1929, Singh and Dutt threw bombs onto the corridors of the assembly and shouted "Inqilab Zindabad, long live the revolution." A shower of leaflets stating that it takes a loud voice to make the deaf hear followed. The bomb neither killed nor injured anyone. Singh and Dutt claimed they deliberately avoided death and injury, a claim substantiated both by British forensic investigators who found that the bomb too weak to cause injury and the bomb had been thrown away from people. Singh and Dutt gave themselves up for arrest after the bomb. He and Dutt received life sentences to transportation for life for the bombing on June 12, 1929. Then came the trial and execution of Bhagat Singh. Shortly after his arrest and trial for the assembly bombing, the British came to know of his involvement in the murder of J.P. Saunders. The courts charged Bhagat Singh, Rajguru and Sukhdev with the murder. Bhagat Singh decided to use the court as a tool to publicize his cause for the independence of India. He admitted to the murder and made statements against the British rule during the trial. The judge ordered the case carried out without members of the HRA present at the hearing. That created an uproar among Singh's supporters as he could no longer publicize his views. While in jail, Bhagat Singh and other prisoners launched a hunger strike advocating for the rights of prisoners and under trial. They struck to protest better treatment of British murderers and thieves than Indian political prisoners, who, by law, would receive better conditions. They aimed through their strike to ensure a decent standard of food for political prisoners, the availability of books and a daily newspaper, as well as better clothing and the supply of toilet necessities and other hygienic necessities. Bhagat Singh also demanded political prisoners exemption from forced labor or undignified work. During that hunger strike that lasted 63 days, and ended with the British succumbing to his wishes, Bhagat Singh gained much popularity among the common Indians. Before the strike, his popularity had been limited mainly to the Punjab region. Bhagat Singh also maintained a diary, eventually filling 404 pages, with notes relating to the quotations and popular sayings of various people whose views he supported. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels held a prominent place. The comments in Bhagat Singh's diary led to an understanding of the philosophical thinking of Bhagat Singh. Before dying, Bhagat Singh also wrote a pamphlet entitled "Why I Am an Atheist," to counter the charge of vanity for rejecting God in the face of death. On March 23, 1931, the British hanged Bhagat Singh in Lahore with his comrades Rajguru and Sukhdev. Bhagat Singh's supporters, who had been protesting against the hanging, immediately declared him as a shaheed or a martyr. According to Superintendent of Police at the time, V. N. Smith, the time of the hanging had been advanced. He said, "Normally execution took place at 8 a.m., but it was decided to act at once before the public could become aware of what had happened. At about 7 p.m., shouts of Inqilab Zindabad were heard from inside the jail. This was correctly interpreted as a signal that the final curtain was about to drop." Bhagat Singh had been cremated at Husainiwala on the banks of Satluj River. Today, the Bhagat Singh Memorial commemorates freedom fighters of India. Let's learn about the political thoughts and opinions of Bhagat Singh. Marxism and Leninism. Bhagat Singh's political thought evolved gradually from Gandhian nationalism to revolutionary Marxism. By the end of 1928, Bhagat Singh and his comrades renamed their organization the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. Bhagat Singh had read the teachings of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Lenin and believed that with such a large and diverse population, India could only survive properly under a socialist regime. Those ideals had been introduced to him during his time at the National College at Lahore, and he believed that India should reenact the Russian Revolution. In the case that India rejected socialism, he believed that the rich would get richer and the poor would only get poorer. That and his militant methods put him at odds with Gandhi and members of the Congress. Bhagat Singh became the first socialist leader in India to make any gain. Even today, socialist leaders sometimes refer back to Bhagat Singh as the founder of Indian socialism. Atheism. While in a condemned cell in 1931, Bhagat Singh wrote a pamphlet entitled "Why I Am an Atheist," in which Bhagat Singh discussed and advocated the philosophy of atheism. That pamphlet arose as a counter to criticism by fellow revolutionaries for his failure to acknowledge religion and God while in a condemned cell, the acquisition of vanity. Bhagat Singh supported his own beliefs and claimed that he used to be a firm believer in the Almighty, but rejected the myths and beliefs that others held close to their hearts. In that pamphlet, Bhagat Singh acknowledged that religion made death easier, but declared unproved philosophy a sign of human weakness. The death of Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh had been known to have an appreciation of martyrdom. Kartar Singh Sarabha had been his mentor as a young boy. Many Indians considered Bhagat Singh a martyr for acting to avenge the death of Lala Lajpat Rai, also considered a martyr. In the leaflet Bhagat Singh threw in the Central Assembly on April 8, 1929, Bhagat Singh stated that it is easy to kill individuals, but you cannot kill the ideals. Great empires crumble while the ideas survive. After engaging in studies of the Russian Revolution, Bhagat Singh wanted to die so that his death would inspire the youth of India to unite and fight the British Empire. While in prison, Bhagat Singh and two others had written a letter to the Viceroy asking him to treat them as prisoners of war and hence to execute them by firing squad rather than by hanging. Prannath Mehta visited him in the jail on March 20th, 4 days before his execution, with a draft letter for clemency, but he declined to sign it. Let's take a look at some of the conspiracy theories. Many conspiracy theories arose regarding Bhagat Singh, especially the events surrounding his death. One theory contains that Mahatma Gandhi had the opportunity to stop Bhagat Singh's execution but refused. That particular theory has spread among the public in modern times after the creation of modern films such as The Legend of Bhagat Singh, which portray Gandhi as someone strongly at odds with Bhagat Singh and supporting his hanging. In a variation of that theory, Gandhi actively conspired with the British to have Singh executed. Both highly controversial conspiracy theories, these have been hotly contested. Mahatma Gandhi's supporters say that Gandhi too little influence with the British to stop the execution, much less arrange it. Furthermore, Gandhi's supporters assert that Bhagat Singh's role in the independence movement posed no threat to Gandhi's role as its leader, so Mahatma Gandhi would have no reason to want him dead. Also, Gandhi, during his lifetime, always maintained a great admiration of Singh's patriotism, but that he simply disapproved of his violent methods. Mahatma Gandhi also said that he opposed Bhagat Singh's execution and proclaimed that he had no power to stop it. On Singh's execution, Gandhi said, "The government certainly had the right to hang these men. However, there are some rights which do credit to those who possess them only if they are enjoyed in name only." Gandhi also once said on capital punishment, "I cannot in all conscience agree to anyone being sent to the gallows. God alone can take life because He alone gives it." Gandhi had managed to have 90,000 political prisoners, members of movements other than his Satyagraha movement, released under the pretext of relieving political tension in the Gandhi-Irvin Pact. According to a report in the Indian magazine Frontline, Mahatma Gandhi did plead several times for the commutation of the death of Bhagat Singh, Rajguru and Sukhdev, including a personal visit on March 19, 1931, and in a letter to the Viceroy on the day of their execution, pleading fervently for commutation without knowing that the letter would be too late. Lord Irwin, the Viceroy, later said, "As I listened to Mr. Gandhi putting the case for commutation before me, I reflected first on what significance it surely was that the apostle of non-violence should so earnestly be pleading the cause of the devotees of a creed so fundamentally opposed to his own. But I should regard it as wholly wrong to allow my judgment to be influenced by purely political considerations. I could not imagine a case in which under the law penalty had been more directly deserved." Let's learn about the legacy of Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh's death had the effect that he desired, and Bhagat Singh inspired thousands of youths to assist the remainder of the Indian independence movement. After his hanging, youths in regions around northern India rioted in protest against the British Raj. In the modern day, the Communist Party of India Marxist itself acknowledges Bhagat Singh's contribution to Indian society and, in particular, the future of socialism in India. To celebrate the centenary of his birth, a group of intellectuals set up an institution to commemorate Bhagat Singh and his ideals. Several popular Bollywood films have been made capturing the life and times of Bhagat Singh. The patriotic Urdu and Hindi songs also refer to the light yellow color of the mustard flower grown in the Punjab, of which some of the colors are largely associated with Bhagat Singh and have been used in a number of films related to him. In September 2007, the governor of Pakistan's Punjab province announced that a memorial to Bhagat Singh will be displayed at Lahore Museum. According to the governor, Bhagat Singh was the first martyr of the subcontinent, and his example was followed by many youth of his time. Let's take a look at some of the famous quotations of Bhagat Singh. "The aim of life is no more to control the mind, but to develop it harmoniously, not to achieve salvation hereafter, but to make the best use of it here below, and not to realize truth, beauty, and good only in contemplation, but also in the actual experience of daily life. Social progress depends not upon the ennoblement of the few, but on the enrichment of democracy. Universal brotherhood can be achieved only when there is an equality of opportunity in the social, political, and individual life." This was from Bhagat Singh's prison diary, 124 page. Thank you very much for listening to this discussion on Bhagat Singh. For more such discussions, get the UPSC Practice app from the App Store.